look at life in the 18th century through the skeletons of Spitalfields on Footsteps of Man.
Hello, I'm David Drew for A&E. As part of the Footsteps of Man series, the Skeletons of Spitalfields follows a unique scientific project which has been studying the bones of 1,000 people. They are not the skeletons of Romans or Egyptians. They were Londoners, people whose coffins were placed in the crypt of Christchurch Spitalfields in East London at the turn of the 19th century. What is remarkable is that from the records of the time, we know who they were in life, what they did, and when and often how they died. Recently, with the agreement of the church authorities, archaeologists, anthropologists, doctors and dentists all collaborated to analyze the bones. The result has been an extraordinary insight into life and death in London some 200 years ago, and perhaps even more important, invaluable data to aid forensic and medical research today. And now, the Skeletons of Spitalfields.
On the day of the funeral, an hour before it occurred, the two men called mutes took their places outside the front door, one on each side of it. The hearse was covered with black cloth and drawn by two black horses. At the parish of Spitalfields, the whole space under the building was laid out as a burial vault. It was here that she wished to be buried.
The lady was buried in 1807. Now she is known simply as number 2309. But who is she, and why is she one of many hundreds of skeletons to be dug up more than a century and a half after her funeral? Christchurch Spitalfields in East London, one of the finest Baroque churches in Britain, completed in 1729 by the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor. More than 1,000 people were buried in its crypt in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Today, the crypt is empty, the body's gone. The coffins are to make way for new facilities for the church and its parishioners. That is not unusual. What is that the bodies were not removed by undertakers, but exhumed and examined by archaeologists. The crypt was closed in the 1860s and sealed with rubble, making access to the first major excavation of a recent British burial site almost impossible.
My leg coffin weighs about a quarter of a ton. You can imagine the problems we had dragging them out of here. It's cramped. This is the main vault, which we entered by coming through a brick wall that was up there. We'd actually knocked a few of the bricks through, and then all we could see was a sea of rubble and coffins. We were actually quite high up, as you can see on here, where the whiter line is. That was the height at which the rubble stopped. So we were actually banging our heads on the ceiling when we came in here. We had no idea where the floor was. We had no idea how many coffins were in here. And no idea how much rubble we'd have to move to actually get to the bottom. And by the end of it, we'd actually taken out about 150 tons of rubble and 335 coffins, which was stacked to a height of sometimes 16 at the sides, and although there were only about 7 in the middle, but a lot more than expected, very crushed, very jumbled, creating all sorts of problems for archaeological recording.
The crypt consists of a warren of smaller vaults that tunnel out from the central area. Some of the space was public. You were buried wherever the sexton put you. Other areas were private, where the well-to-do would pay to be with their own families. But no matter who you were, it was an unsavory place. There are reports of parishioners fainting in services because of the so-called putrid emanations, or the smell of decomposing bodies seeping up from the crypt. The respect paid to the dead at the funeral did not always reach beyond the crypt door. In the church, one of the pillars of Spitalfields society, Alderman, Lord Mayor of London and MP Sir Robert Ladbroke, has been immortalised in stone. Sir Robert's mortal remains were consigned to the crypt below.
This is the family vault in which Sir Robert Ladbroke was buried. And although he had quite an augmented status in life, he wasn't treated with any special respect down here by the sexton. In fact, we know his coffin was put in here on its head end in the corner because the residue of the body had rotted through the head end of the coffin, and it was only later on, when they were filling the vault up with building rubble, that the coffin was knocked over and fell over half upright and half horizontal, lying at the bottom of the steps.
The team of 15 archaeologists working over 18 months coped with extremely difficult working conditions. There were high lead levels from the corroding coffins. There was even a false alarm that any human tissue that survived might carry smallpox.
The already bizarre nature of the crypt as a place to work in was made worse, if you like, by the fact that there was an extraordinarily wide range of types of preservation of all sorts of material, but especially human material. You might examine a coffin which contained a skeleton, just bones, clean, dry bones, very easy for us to deal with. You might open a coffin next to it and find that the coffin was full of what we call body liquor, a dark brown liquid. And underneath the body liquor you would find an almost completely preserved human being. Eyelashes, hair, toenails, everything completely preserved, including all the tissue. Not only was this a difficult problem to deal with archaeologically, it was a difficult problem to deal with emotionally.
I think if we did this sort of site again, we would be prepared to think more about people taking leave, not working down on site so often, because the place was too claustrophobic to stay down here all the time because of the illness, minor illnesses and infections caused by dust and the darkness and everything like that. We just weren't prepared for the effects of them. Obviously, if somebody has a death in the family who's working on the site during the excavation, it makes it very difficult to return to work, and in compassionate leave extends a lot longer than usual, because you're aware of all the time of your mortality, because you're dealing with other people's mortality, and it's just part of the job most of the time, but sometimes it's a bit too poignant.
The skeletons are on the move. There were 42 that still retained human tissue, and these had to be cremated immediately. But the rest were sent for analysis to a museum better known for its older and larger inhabitants. At the Natural History Museum in London, the Spitalfields skeletons are stored away from public view. Each batch of bones is numbered and recorded. But all other information about them has been deliberately concealed from the experts, because their research is as much about their own methods of analysis as about the skeletons themselves. And the first test they set up was to see how good they were at aging old bones.
Most archaeological groups would envisage that, I think, the average age of death of people in the past was 30. Very, very few people lived to an old age. And it gives you an impression of populations in the past that were essentially young, no veterans, no older people. And you wonder how society ran like that. And yet, when you look at, say, tombstones, you find lots of people over 60 are commemorated on these tombstones. Archaeologists have always defended this by saying, well, those who get tombstones were the old because they were special. They had achieved this great age as something extraordinary. But I became increasingly worried about this when I saw diseases of old age among people. And I thought, well, perhaps it's our techniques that are wrong. Perhaps our methods of aging are not actually giving us the correct ages. They're not sufficiently precise to enable us to determine within, say, even 20 years how old somebody was when they died. So it seemed to me that we must try to test these methods and try to evaluate which are the more accurate ones and which are the ones that we should perhaps use a bit more circumspectly.
Footsteps of Man will continue in a moment. A&E. We return to the skeletons of Spitalfields on A&E.
As archaeologists become more interested in societies in the past, then I think it becomes increasingly important to understand what the age structure of those communities was. It's a very different society when you've got essentially young people around, from one with older groups of people, with grannies looking after the children, providing their expertise for the next generation. This is very, very important, whether you're dealing with Roman populations, Anglo-Saxons, or Georgians.
We asked the museum researchers to test the standard archaeological aging methods on one Georgian in particular, skeleton number 2309. Aging is done by looking for physical signs of growth or degeneration. Several bones are examined and given a score. Then the average of these taken as an estimate of age at death. But there are problems. Different people can age at different rates. So too can different parts of the same body. Babies have sutures or lines where the bones of the skull join up. In adulthood, the bones fuse together and the lines disappear, as they have here. This indicates that 2309 was over 55. The rib ends change shape as you get older, and 2309 suggests an age of 37, a lot younger than the skull. The degeneration of the pubic joint of the pelvis indicates an age in the same range as the ribs, 36. So we have three estimates, 55, 37, and 36, which, as an average, suggests that 2309 died at the age of 43. But there is another indicator of age, the teeth. The skull was packed up and delivered to the Cardiff Dental School. Using conventional archaeological techniques, how old do 2309's teeth make her when she died?
The conventional way of aging a skull like this has certain considerable limitations. What we would do before destroying any of the tissue or looking at the teeth in detail would be to take an X-ray like this. And the third molar or wisdom teeth here are completely developed. And that tells me straight away that this skull is, well, older than about 23 years as a minimum age. The next thing that we look for is the wear pattern on the teeth. And this is a particularly difficult one because if we sort of fit the jaws together like that, we can see that there's an enormous irregularity in the way the teeth are wearing against each other. So we're not getting a regular pattern. This tooth is fairly heavily worn, whereas this one is not worn at all, and these here are massively worn, so that we would get three different ages by looking at the teeth. I think I would have to say that this individual would be late middle age, 45. But what I'd like to do is to try and employ a much more scientific method, which means taking one of these teeth out, and then we section this and examine it under the microscope and use a standard forensic method for producing age in the same way that we would for a dead body.
As a forensic dentist, David Whittaker's techniques are highly specialized.
The main objective is to identify dead bodies of one kind or another, and also to give opinions in court on dental injuries, bites that teeth have caused, and so on. It doesn't really matter to me whether a body has been dead for 3 months or 6 months or 150 years. The teeth are unique almost in that they retain information for centuries, maybe even for 3,000 years. So that if I look at teeth that are 3 months old, I would expect to get the same kind of information from them that I can get from teeth that are 200 years old. And this is the big advantage of teeth in studies of this kind.
Forensic dentistry is not usually an option for archaeologists. It's expensive and destructive. But with 2309 and the other skeletons from Spitalfields, archaeology may help forensics as much as forensics helps archaeology.
The massive advantage of something like Spitalfields is the large numbers of skeletons involved. And although we're not going to remove very much in the way of teeth from them, perhaps one tooth per aged body, this is far more than we've ever had before in samples of this nature. And so we are hoping that it's going to solve some of our day-to-day problems that we meet trying to advise the police about aging of modern-day individuals. Our methods of aging are not terribly accurate. I claim to be able to get to within about 7 years either way in a forensic case. And that, I don't think, is terribly good. And that really is why we're trying to use this material to develop and refine that down so that hopefully we can get to within 2 or 3 years, or maybe even better. Can you just support this stone nice and tight for a while so that it doesn't move, and try and press against me so that as I push in, you try and support it from the opposite. That's it. Great. Fine. Yeah, we're winning.
(2309's eye tooth is painstakingly sectioned. One wrong move and the tooth will shatter.
As people get older, the roots of their teeth become more and more transparent. So what I'm looking for here is the amount of transparent root on this tooth. And yes, unfortunately, it isn't evenly transparent on both sides of the tooth, so it's quite a difficult one. On the top edge of the tooth, where the blackish area is, it's rather shorter. That's about 9 millimetres. And along the bottom edge, we've got a transparent area that's just over 12 millimetres. So if we take the average of those two, we're working out that in whole numbers just about 11 millimetres. So we can plot that figure against this standard that we've prepared from forensic cases, and we work from 11 millimetres. That was our average. Try and do this as carefully as I can. That's near enough. And then we can look across horizontally from that to the left-hand scale, which is the scale of years. Project that over there, and it comes out at 71 years. And I'd be fairly confident about that, to perhaps 6 or 7 years either way. So let's say she's 71.
Footsteps of Man will continue in a moment. We return to the skeletons of Spitalfields on A&B.
So who had the right answer? Did this woman die in her mid-40s or her early 70s? Now the tests are complete, her coffin plate can be revealed.
Mrs. Louisa Perina Courtauld, widow. Died 12th of January, 1807. Aged 77 years.
The forensic answer was very close, though not spot on. But archaeological techniques were way out, knocking 34 years off Louisa's life. In fact, we know more than Louisa's name and her age. We know what she looked like. Louisa Courtauld, 1729 to 1807, as she was in the prime of life. It It was the job of the Spitalfields historian to track down the family records of all the named skeletons.
In terms of British archaeology, it's absolutely unique to know who a skeleton was. And with this population, we can actually now start to find out who these people were, where they lived, what they did, what they ate, what they wore, and things like the climate and the environment generally. And for this, we need to look at parish records and other historical documents, which fortunately abound for this period.
The most striking feature about the names of those buried in the crypt was that so many were French, Huguenot refugees fleeing religious persecution who settled around Spitalfields.
You see wonderful lists of French names, for example, Gaudin, Chevalier, Ogier, that type of thing. And these names predominate through our population until the early part of the 19th century, when the English names seem to overtake, and you get Smiths and Curtises and Griffiths and the like. Louisa's maiden name was Ogier, and she was definitely French. She was in fact born in France, as were all of her siblings, many of whom are in fact buried in the crypt.
Some French refugees, like Louisa's family, were lucky to escape with money and skills, and they colonized the smartest streets in Spitalfields. But as an adult, Louisa moved out of the parish. In fact, many of the crypt population had settled elsewhere when they died. But sentimental reasons drew them back at death to the place where their families and friends had first set up home and prospered. That prosperity came principally from the textile trade. The same industry has continued to flourish in the area through generations of immigrant communities, first Huguenots and then Jews and Bengalis. Louisa's family, the well-to-do Ogiers, were silk merchants, although the equally wealthy French family she married into were not.
Louisa Perrina Ogier married Samuel Courtauld, another Huguenot, a goldsmith, although in fact he was a silversmith, but he belonged to the goldsmith company. Shortly after the birth of their 8th child, Samuel died at the age of about 40, and as was normal for the period, in anyone in a profession, the widow took over the running of the husband's business, and it's quite specifically stated in the company records that it's expected that widows are responsible for her husband's liabilities, apprentices, etc. So if we look in the trade directories for the right sort of time, just after Samuel Courtauld died, we can see if Louise is listed as running the business. And in fact she is. It says Courtauld LP, Goldsmith, 21 Cornhill.
Generations later, it is not silverware that Louisa's heirs are noted for, but textiles. The latest descendant to pursue the profession is George Courtauld. He worked for 25 years for the international textile company that takes his family's name. What did he make of the unexpected reappearance of his great-great-great-great-grandmother, Louisa?
Well, when I heard that she'd been dug up, my feelings were twofold, really. Partly curiosity, and really partly indignation. I thought, once you're in your grave, you should stay there. And I presumed that she was being cleared out to make room for a discotheque or something. And second, which I believe I'm wrong, and secondly, I did feel curiosity because I wanted to know why they wanted to know these questions. They wanted to know what she'd eaten, what was her social standing, what was her job, how many children she'd had. And dabbling a bit in anthropology and archaeology myself, I was obviously intrigued in the sort of questions they asked and the things they wanted to discover. Well, I knew of her basically in the portrait we call the Zophany, which is a portrait of a rather rugged-looking woman with big hands, with a rather nice dress. And it's a beautiful painting, but she herself is not particularly attractive. But she has a nice face, I think, and a strong face, with a rather knobbly nose, which I've still inherited, I think, and my father had, and some of my cousins have still got a nose. That's something which is handed on, as well as perhaps an inclination to work hard, some of us anyhow. And she was a fairly forceful character. She was a good businesswoman. And, for example, when one of her daughters wanted to get married, she was thoroughly against the idea because the young man had a measly income of £300 a year, which £300 a year wasn't bad in those days. I got, in fact, with 8 volumes of family letters, most of which were found in a big box in Gosfield Hall. And there's one here which I marked. When the daughter got engaged, she unengaged them, and then wrote a letter to the young man saying, I've seen your account books. And this letter's dated 1782, 11th of May. She said, the difference I see is £340 instead of 300, and I therefore can give my consent, which meant that she was quibbling over £40, which would be all right for her daughter to marry into, but £300 a year is just not enough, in her opinion.
Skeletal remains are a storehouse of information about the way people lived and died. Some diseases leave their mark on the bones. Louisa most likely died of old age and left no telltale signs. Not all the crypt population died so peacefully, but we wouldn't know that from written records alone.
Well, normally the historian has access only to things like bills of mortality, or if you're lucky to death certificates. But these really are not terribly helpful. For example, this lady died of senile debility and convulsions, this one of decay of nature, this one of natural decay, and here's one who died of mortification in the feet. Well, we could assume that that might be gangrene secondary to a disease like diabetes. But really, to get any notion of what diseases affected the people, you need to turn to the bones, because a surprising number of diseases do show on the bones, and we have access to this evidence. For example, here's a man who had syphilis, with very profound changes in the skull, and he would have had signs and symptoms elsewhere, pains in the legs, he might have gone mad. That was a common way of ending your days if you were syphilitic to this degree. He might also have had mercury poisoning, because the common treatment for syphilis was mercury, either in ointment or some form of compound. And the old medical joke of the 18th century was that you had a night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. So you ended your days in a very unhappy state, possibly with secondary infection of the scalp, which would have been really pretty awful, both for him and for anyone nearby him. Something else the bones can tell us is about the signs of trauma. Got a very nice one here, which was perplexing at the time that I looked at it, with a lot of fractures in the ribs, all on the right side, a lot of fractures along the right ribs here, all well healed, with a fracture in the left side of the pelvis. You can see here how it's fractured, but healed very well, but there's been some retraction of the bone in that direction. And it wasn't very clear what this was caused by until we came across an illustration in an old medical book, which seemed to explain it. And probably what happened is that this chap was walking along, minding his own business, and a carriage came, hit him hard on the right, breaking his ribs, banging him into the wall, so his pelvis swung forward. So this is probably an 18th or 19th century road traffic accident. But he survived. He would have lost a lot of blood. He would have been in great pain. He'd have been in bed for a long time, but he did survive without any infection, and obviously for some considerable time afterwards. So that, again, is a very interesting illustration of what one can find from the bones, and there's no other way that you can get any of that sort of evidence at all.
We return to the skeletons of Spitalfields on A&B.
Dr. Waldron is an occupational physician and has a special interest in work-related diseases, particularly arthritis.
Then I pass it back again with my foot up and keep it back again. So we're doing exactly the same on.
No one knows for certain what causes arthritis, but it is often assumed to be work-related, the result of repeated pressure on the same joints. Dr. Waldron wanted to put this theory to the test on the manual workers in the crypt population. In particular, he set out to compare the bones of the Spitalfields weavers with those of the rest of the population to see which group suffered more from arthritis. But first he wanted to find out from a retired weaver today which joints were most likely to be affected. The looms at Paradise Hall in Macclesfield were still functioning commercially in the 1970s, and Jim Clark wove here all his working life.
When you're weaving with that, how are your hands at the end of the day?
Just a little bit now and again, you know. Once here I'm not doing much weaving, you see. I only come in here perhaps once a fortnight for half an hour.
Yeah. What about when you were doing the 3 shuttles at once?
Well, you kept on going.
But does that make your hands ache at all?
Oh, yeah, that makes hands ache a bit.
So but it was all right the next day?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Which bones in your hands did it hurt in?
Well, right on you, because you've got it, what you're using. You're using that all the time.
Just show me which bones it hurt in.
Well, it's mostly around here, you know.
Yeah.
The 40 Spitalfields weavers were not all machinists. Some would have progressed to master craftsmen and stopped weaving, so the sample was limited. But Dr. Waldron examined all the manual workers in the crypt, and the results were the same as for the weavers.
We found the weavers at Spitalfields had no osteoarthritis of the hip, none of the knees, which are 2 joints in which we would have expected it. And so far as osteoarthritis of the hands was concerned, their rates were exactly the same as those of the rest of the population. So I think we can say that we've got conclusive evidence here that the occupation was not a factor in the development of osteoarthritis. And this means that archaeologists who've been making assumptions about the disease in the past, and perhaps modern clinicians, are going to have to look again at the factors which cause the disease, such as environment and diet and heredity, and give occupation a much less prominent place than they've been prone to do in the past. And this is another case where I think archaeology has added to our knowledge of modern medicine.
The Spitalfields research has also increased our knowledge of the history of healthcare, especially dentistry. Not much is known about it at the time when Louisa Courtauld was alive. Louisa herself suffered from chronic gum disease, had lost 12 teeth, and needed 10 fillings. All of the crypt population could have done with a trip to a modern-day dentist, but their Georgian counterparts did what they could.
We ought to start by looking at some fillings, I think. Here are some nice gold fillings along the teeth, 6 or 7 in this particular mouth, and some in the lower jaw as well. I don't think these would have been terribly effective because they've been really squeezed into areas of decay in the teeth, and I don't think, in fact, it would have prevented the decay from continuing. So inevitably, a lot of these people would have ended up with loss of teeth, and that's where the dentures come in. If you haven't lost many teeth, the sensible thing is to have a partial denture like this one. This is a beautifully constructed one in gold. It's been fitted around the standing teeth and swaged around them by, we can only say, a craftsman of the highest order. And then there have been porcelain teeth to match the patient's own standing teeth there to replace those front ones. And that would have looked quite good, I think, aesthetically, and really would have been quite good functionally as well. The problem is that those dentures would eventually fail, I think, because the teeth on which they're supported would have become decayed, and so we move on to the full denture. And this would have been a very difficult problem to deal with in those days. Here's a beauty. You take one out. This one is the upper one. These would have been handmade to fit the gum. A very lengthy process, a very skilled process. None of the impressions that we use nowadays. And these porcelain teeth would have been handmade to fit this particular individual's mouth and then fastened on with little gold pins. We think that these would probably have cost about £70 real money at the time of Spitalfields' burial, and that works out into many thousands of pounds now. Maybe that explains why we've only got about 15 of these with dentures in them. Something for the rich, to put it mildly. This is a very interesting denture too. The base of the denture has been made in bone and hand-carved again to fit. The teeth are what we would call Waterloo teeth. some remains of teeth. But what happened was that on the battlefields of Waterloo were many corpses, and Britain used to send out ladies to dig amongst the corpses and force the mouths open and extract the teeth from the corpses, bring them back, and then the local dentists or dental technicians would shape these teeth to fit onto their bone base plates, so that you'd end up with a soldier's teeth in your own mouth. Not only did you have Waterloo teeth, you had these amazing springs. These particular ones are made out of copper, sometimes they're made out of gold. And the object of these was that because the dentures fitted so badly, you needed something to kind of spring them up into the top of your mouth and down into the bottom, rather like this. I mean, imagine sort of trying to eat with something like that. And we suspect, in fact there's a lot of evidence for it, that the gentry wore these dentures for social occasions and took them out to eat. Actually, they're not alone in that, some people do that today as well. But we have improved matters since those dentures were made round about the 1800s.
This is how Louisa was found, nothing more than teeth and bones. But in some well-preserved cases, even the clothes people were buried in have survived. The fabrics from the coffins were taken to Bradford University for conservation. They need very careful handling.
The trouble with dealing with this sort of material is that obviously the textiles have got soaked into them the body decomposition products, and this is quite an unpleasant job to remove them.
The fabrics have to be immersed in a special detergent for 24 hours to clean them thoroughly. Costume museums often possess ceremonial garments from weddings and christenings, but 18th and 19th century burial clothes are understandably rare.
This is an example here of a man's jacket from burial in 1847. As you can see, it's a normal, everyday garment. It would have been dyed originally, but the body decomposition products have bleached that out. However, most bodies were buried in an article like this. This is a shroud, a backless garment with sleeves. As you can see at first sight, it looks quite fine and ornate. But on closer examination, you can see that this is not brodeur anglaise, it's just simply punched, there's no hemming on it. And in fact, these frills are quite crudely done in a way. And this is very much a disposable garment. It wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in wear, as it were. The same fact is also found on things like this man's cap, which again is very fine punching, but nonetheless quite crude. The exciting thing about this project is that it's been able to show with the textiles that we've got specialist clothing used in the funeral trade. We assumed that it was people being buried in things like night dresses, or maybe some specialist clothing, but we didn't imagine that in fact there was quite so much textiles incorporated into the burial as a part of the package.
Footsteps of Man will continue in a moment.
November the 8th, 1824, for the interment of Master Charles Strong in the Poor Ground. Ground, 2 shillings. Rector, 1 shilling and 6pence. Clerk, 1 shilling and 2pence. Sexton, 1 shilling. Grave digger, 1 shilling. Total, 6 shillings, 8pence.
The rector of Christchurch in 1840 was quite willing to admit that he made a substantial income out of burial in the graveyard, and more specifically in the crypt. And the church warden and the sexton and the sexton's mates would also have made a certain amount of money, and they'd have made more money from people who wanted to be buried in the crypt. During the early part of the 19th century, an anatomist in a school of anatomy in London would have probably paid 4 guineas for a body, and there were many people who were quite willing to steal bodies from graveyards. Obviously, it's much more difficult to steal bodies from a crypt, and so there is a certain amount of security, literally, in being buried in a crypt.
Louisa Courtauld was safe from the 19th century body snatchers when she was buried in the crypt on the 20th of January, 1807. But in the 20th century, some might say a rather similar fate befell her. Why did Louisa's remains have to be disturbed at all? The decision to move the bodies was made not by the archaeologists, but by the church, who urgently needed new facilities for the parish. In fact, part of the crypt already has a different use. In the 1960s, one section was converted into a refuge for alcoholics.
42. Going back too far.
We were faced with the question that we needed to bring the church back fully into use for people, because the church is for people, and we needed space for people to meet in other than in the church itself, and we needed space for common sense things like toilets, kitchens, servery and so on, and the only place to go was beneath the church floor where there was space. Just as we had already cleared quite a bit of it for alcoholic recovery work, we now needed to clear the rest of it for further community use.
The church has been in a bad state of repair for many years. Emptying the crypt was part of a wider program of refurbishment and restoration. But the decision to invite the archaeologists to do the job, instead of a professional crypt clearing company, was a moral as well as a practical one.
When you have as vast a sample of human remains as 1,000, which we had, it had a very important medical and scientific implications, what people died of, what the industries of the area did to their bodies, but we preface it all with the importance of the respect for the human body, respect for the dead, because Christians recognise that human bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Christ died for them, they were made in God's image, and we must always respect those remains. So having said that, we could also see the humanitarian value of increased knowledge, scientifically and medically, from such a big sample from a given area, and knowing the social background. And I have to be honest and say it was also, of course, something that other people would fund, because it's very expensive to remove 1,000 remains from the crypt, and it meant that Nuffield Trust, who were very good to us, and others, because of its scientific and medical interest, would pay. Eventually, we believe as Christians that there is the resurrection of the dead, and these human remains are related to what God will one day do when people are raised from the dead. But meanwhile, we shall have them cremated and brought back here where they wanted to be in the first place, and they will be put in the church garden, which is a beautiful place to put them, and they will be near to where they wanted to be.
We've learned more than we could have believed possible from this collection. We've learned about the people there, how they lived and died, and the stresses that they went through and what their lifestyle was like. We've learned about ourselves as archaeologists, and we've learned, I think, a lot about the limitations of our techniques, and perhaps something about what we can begin to do about it. Because we now understand a lot more about the enormous range of human variability, the enormous differences between individuals of the same age. We don't yet understand why, but I think in the future we may come to a deeper understanding of really what it's all about, what aging processes are. And I feel really very, very privileged to have been allowed to get to know this group of people better.
The research is still in its early stages. It will go on for the next 5 years at least. Then the skeletons will be returned to their final resting place at Spitalfields. except for Louisa. The Courtauld family are already making plans for her second burial, this time in Essex.
Do they cover a certain area? Well, from about... Well, it seems to be the natural place. We've already got 33 members of the family buried here. And I think most of us think of Gosfield churchyard as our family graveyard. And it'll be nice to think that she'll be back amongst all her descendants. She's even got one of her daughters here. Well, I think Louisa Perrino would have, knowing her character, the little I know of it, I think she would have been quite interested, quite intrigued to know that she'd come out of the grave after being there 180 years and have done something useful after being dead for so long. And I hope she wasn't and isn't upset. And I think she wouldn't have minded. I think she would have been quite amused that she'd been useful after being dead 180 years. Yeah. My aunt Ruth, who died at the age of 99. She used to wear a green eye shade. They're my parents. George Courtauld, there's 4 George Courtaulds in this graveyard. And then perhaps if there's a gap here. Yes. Perhaps if she goes somewhere like this, she'll be John Minton Courtauld, that's her grandson, born 1807. We put her somewhere, say, in that gap.
It seems almost as if that space is provided.
Yes. Or perhaps at the end of the wall. But this looks better somehow, I think.
Yes, I think so.
And let's hope she'll stay there for the rest of the next millennium anyhow, rather than be dug up again.
Sunday, Michael Palin consults an astrologer to see what the stars have in store as his race continues on Around the World in 80 Days. Now, stay tuned for real-life drama in war-torn Germany on Christabel, next on A&E.